On April 17, 2013, in the small town of West, Texas, a fire broke out at the West Fertilizer plant. Within minutes, the facility erupted in a massive explosion that registered as a small earthquake. The blast killed 15 people, injured more than 200, and destroyed an entire neighborhood. In a single instant, a quiet community was turned into a disaster zone.
The town of West Texas sat quietly along Interstate 35, just north of Waco. With a population of around 2,800 people in 2013, it was the kind of place where life moved slowly, and everyone seemed to know one another. West was best known for its Czech heritage, its bakeries, and its reputation as a tight-knit community. To outsiders, it was little more than a small dot on the Texas map, a stop for food or fuel on the drive between Dallas and Austin. But for the people who lived there, it was home, a place of familiarity and safety. On the northern edge of town stood the West Fertilizer Company, a plant that had been in operation since the 1960s. To most residents, it was simply part of the landscape. The facility blended into the background, surrounded by fields, modest homes, and community buildings. Across the road sat a nursing home and an apartment complex. A middle school and high school were only a few hundred feet away. The plant was not isolated on the outskirts of town. It was embedded in the middle of everyday life. The company's primary business was selling and storing agricultural chemicals, including ammonium nitrate. For farmers, ammonium nitrate was a valuable fertilizer. For scientists and regulators, however, it was also known as a volatile and dangerous substance when stored in large quantities. The same chemical had been involved in some of the deadliest explosions in modern history. Most famously the Texas City disaster of 1947, and decades later, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. Despite this, the risks often faded into the background when facilities operated without incident for years. The West Fertilizer plant had a record that was far from spotless. Over the decades, regulators cited the company for a variety of safety violations, including improper storage of chemicals and failure to maintain equipment. Yet inspections were infrequent and enforcement was inconsistent. In 2011, the company reported to federal officials that it was storing as much as 270 tons of ammonium nitrate on site. Despite the sheer volume of this material, the plant lacked basic safety measures such as fire sprinklers or blast-resistant storage. Most residents of West did not know, or perhaps did not fully grasp, the scale of what was being kept just down the road. It was simply a fact of life that the fertilizer plant was there. People drove past it every day on their way to work, school, or church. Some lived right across the street. Children played in backyards only a short distance from where the chemicals were stacked. Few could have imagined that such an ordinary part of their town held the potential for unimaginable destruction. By the spring of 2013, the West Fertilizer plant had been in operation for over 50 years. It was small, unassuming, and largely unnoticed outside the community, but within its walls sat the ingredients for disaster. Chemicals that, under the right conditions, could level buildings and shatter lives in an instant. All it would take was a spark.
On the evening of April 17, 2013, the town of West Texas settled into a routine spring night. The air was calm and the sun had just slipped below the horizon. At the northern edge of town, workers at the West Fertilizer plant noticed smoke rising inside one of the storage buildings. At first, it seemed like a small fire, nothing out of the ordinary in a facility that handled chemicals and machinery. But the fire was spreading quickly, feeding on wooden structures and stored materials inside. At 7:29 p.m., the first call reporting a fire at the plant came into the local emergency line. West did not have a large professional fire department. Instead, the town relied on volunteer firefighters, men and women who lived in the community, who worked ordinary jobs by day, and who responded to emergencies when called. Within minutes, sirens wailed as the volunteers mobilized. Trucks rolled toward the facility. By 7:37 p.m., the first firefighters were on scene. They faced heavy smoke and flames that seemed to be concentrated in a warehouse area where fertilizer and chemicals were stored. To them, it was a fire that needed to be controlled quickly. They had no way of knowing that just yards away were hundreds of tons of ammonium nitrate, a substance capable of creating an explosion with devastating force. Residents of West began to notice the smoke rising over town. Some stepped outside their homes, others gathered in parking lots, and a few even began recording the growing fire on their phones. From a distance, the fire looked like a strange glow at the edge of the sky. From closer up, it was an inferno, and the firefighters were already deep in the fight. At 7:45 p.m., reinforcements arrived. More volunteers, including emergency medical technicians and town officials who had rushed to help. Among them were some of the most trusted members of the community. They formed a line, preparing hoses and equipment, attempting to contain the fire before it spread to other parts of the facility. But inside the warehouse, the heat was intensifying. Flames reached the ammonium nitrate storage. The chemical, stable under normal conditions, begins to decompose violently when exposed to extreme heat. Once that reaction begins, it can no longer be stopped. At 7:51 p.m., the unimaginable happened. A blinding flash of light erupted, followed by a massive explosion. The blast tore through the plant with the power of 12,000 pounds of TNT. A firebolt rose into the sky, and a shockwave rolled across the town. The explosion registered as a 2.1 magnitude earthquake on the Richter scale. People as far as 50 miles away reported feeling the ground shake. The firefighters at the scene never had a chance. 12 of them were killed instantly, along with 3 civilians who were nearby. The emergency vehicles parked close to the plant were destroyed, reduced to twisted wreckage. Across the street, the nursing home collapsed, trapping elderly residents inside. Windows shattered, ceilings fell, and panicked staff struggled to carry residents out through the smoke and dust. At the apartment complex, buildings were flattened. Families scrambled through the rubble, searching for loved ones in the dark. The middle school and high school, located just blocks away, sustained heavy damage. Had the explosion occurred earlier in the day, when classrooms were full, the loss of life would have been far greater. The shock wave ripped through homes across town. Doors were blown off their hinges. Roofs collapsed. Glass sprayed into living rooms and kitchens. For a moment, many residents thought an earthquake or even a bomb had struck. Emergency dispatchers were overwhelmed by a flood of calls. Some were reporting injuries, others were trapped under debris, and still others were simply screaming in panic. The small town's resources were instantly exhausted. Help was needed from surrounding cities, and mutual aid units from across Texas began rushing toward West. Meanwhile, those who had been filming the fire captured the horror on video. One clip showed the flames glowing in the distance before the screen was consumed by a brilliant flash. The camera shook violently as the person holding it screamed, knocked back by the shock wave. These recordings would later become some of the most haunting evidence of the explosion's sheer force. In the minutes after the blast, survivors stumbled through the wreckage. The nursing home staff pulled residents from the collapsed building, some injured and bleeding. Families clawed through rubble, searching for loved ones in the dark. Roads were blocked with debris, making it difficult for ambulances and fire trucks from outside towns to reach the area. What had begun as a small fire escalated into one of the deadliest industrial disasters in modern American history.
In less than 20 minutes, an entire section of West had been obliterated. By 8 p.m., the scale of the tragedy was clear. The fire was no longer the problem. The blast had already done its damage. First responders from neighboring towns began arriving, but many of West's own firefighters were gone. The people who would normally have led the rescue were among the dead.
When the smoke finally began to settle over West, the scale of the destruction became clear. Entire blocks of the small town had been reduced to rubble. The nursing home was in ruins, the apartment complex flattened, and dozens of family homes were nothing more than splintered wood and shattered glass. Emergency crews from Waco, Dallas, and beyond poured into the town through the night, searching through debris with flashlights and listening for the faint sounds of survivors. 15 people were dead. 12 of them were first responders, volunteer firefighters, medics, and a local town official who had rushed toward the fire without hesitation. More than 200 others were injured, many with burns, broken bones, or lacerations caused by flying debris. Nearly every resident of West either lost a home, knew someone who was injured, or mourned a friend or family member who did not survive. In total, more than 150 buildings were damaged or destroyed. The blast caused over $100 million in property loss. The middle school and high school were heavily damaged and forced to close. For years, the skyline of West bore the scar of the crater where the plant once stood. The question of how such a disaster could happen in the first place quickly became the focus of state and federal investigators. Initially, officials treated the incident as an accident, another tragic example of the dangers posed by ammonium nitrate. But the deeper investigators looked, the more troubling details emerged. The West Fertilizer Company had reported storing up to 270 tons of ammonium nitrate. Yet the plant lacked even basic safeguards, such as fire sprinklers, blast-resistant storage, or an automatic alarm system. Federal and state agencies had cited the company for safety violations in the past, but oversight had been minimal. For many, the tragedy revealed just how vulnerable small towns across America were to hazardous industries operating in their midst. In 2016, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives announced a stunning conclusion. The fire that led to the explosion had been intentionally set. The disaster, once thought to be an industrial accident, was now officially labeled a criminal act. Yet despite years of investigation, no suspect was ever identified, and no charges were filed. For the families of the victims, the declaration raised more questions than answers. The explosion of West Texas became a turning point in the national debate over chemical safety. Regulators reviewed how and where hazardous materials were stored. Lawmakers called for stricter reporting requirements and better protections for communities living in the shadow of industrial plants. But for West, those changes came too late. Even today, the scars remain. Memorials honor the first responders who gave their lives. Residents still remember the sound of the explosion and the moment their town was torn apart. The West Fertilizer disaster was not just a tragedy. It was a reminder of how quickly an ordinary night can descend into chaos, and how the greatest dangers can sometimes be hiding in plain sight.